The women's movement started in the 1800s when women were upset with their lack of legal rights in the United States, including their inability to own property or vote. Led by figures such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and, later on, Alice Paul, this first wave of feminism ultimately resulted in the passing of the 19th Amendment, which granted all women the right to vote.
Second wave feminism began to pick up in the 1960s and 70s, and this time the focus was placed on equality in the workplace, namely equal pay for equal work and acceptance of more women into higher paying fields such as science, technology, engineering, or math. In the early 1960s, women had a difficult time working in higher paying fields because many employers feared that they could become pregnant at any moment and have to take a leave of absence. Also, the social expectation was still largely for women to be stay-at-home wives and mothers, and there was a stigma surrounding women trying to enter more technical fields. One medical school dean even stated, "Hell yes, we have a quota. We do keep women out when we can. We don't want them here, and they don't want them elsewhere either, whether or not they'll admit it." This was the attitude blocking many women from higher education and more advanced fields, and this was a huge catalyst for the women's movement of the 60s and 70s. As of 1960, just 38% of women worked, but this number would soon increase. These women, however, earned on average 59% of what their male counterparts did, leading to much of second-wave feminism being directed at equal pay.
Second-wave feminist activism mainly consisted of gaining media attention for the issue and lobbying Congress for legislative change. Sometimes this was extremely informal. Anyone could march with a sign if they wanted to. However, some major people and events made significant contributions to the movement. An activist named Betty Friedan is often credited with inciting second-wave feminism. She wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique in 1963, in which she encouraged American women to seek employment to find fulfillment beyond housework. Although this was mainly written towards upper-class, educated white women, it sparked a movement of women striving for equal opportunity. In 1966, Betty Friedan helped found the National Organization for Women with the goal of enforcing the employment equality granted by the Equal Rights Act of 1964. Sex discrimination had initially been added to this act as a joke, so legislators didn't take it very seriously and enforced it loosely, if at all. The National Organization for Women led several demonstrations and held events to spread awareness and gain attention for the movement. Although now did extensive work to promote gender equality, they are often criticized for including mainly straight, wealthy, white women. They feared that association with more controversial movements such as the gay rights movement would bring negative publicity to their own movement, so unfortunately many individuals were excluded from the organization's work. They are still active today, although not as well known as they were in the 60s and 70s.
In 1968, frustration with societal gender roles was reflected in the Miss America demonstration, in which hundreds of protesters stood outside the pageant with signs criticizing the beauty standards and objectification of women. This effectively drew media attention to the women's movement. In 1970, on the 50th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which granted women the right to vote, 50,000 women marched in New York in the Women's Strike for Equality. 100,000 other women marched across the nation as well. This march was to protest for equality in the workplace, arguing that although women now had the right to vote, there were still vast gender inequalities plaguing the nation. Gloria Steinem, a longtime activist for gender equality, founded Ms. Magazine in 1971 as a way of spreading the ideas and goals of the movement. This magazine is still active today, although it is not as well known as it was in the 70s.
One major legislative attempt at equality was the Equal Rights Amendment. This would be used to help enforce the sex equality granted by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The amendment stated that equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. Supporters of equality in the workplace pushed for this amendment because it would add legislative power to the movement. However, the amendment also had many opponents who claimed that it would dismantle the traditional family, use public funding for abortions, and promote gay rights. One of the amendment's most prominent opponents was Phyllis Schlafly. She thought that the Equal Rights Amendment, known as ERA, would take away programs such as child support and military exemption for women. She stretched these beliefs to use fear tactics to scare women into also opposing the ERA. For example, she claimed that the amendment would lead to unisex toilets and mandatory military service for women.
The Equal Rights Amendment passed Congress in 1972, but its opposition was too strong. It was never ratified by enough states to pass, so the ERA never became law. In 1972, Title IX of the Education Amendments made strides for the women's movement in education by banning discrimination based on sex. This had a huge effect on athletics funding, but also impacted academics and public university admissions.
Also at this time was a social movement called the Sexual Revolution. This called into question the social concepts which accepted and even encouraged premarital sex for men, but not for women. This connected to the feminist idea that women should have control over their own bodies. Many rape crisis centers and women's health clinics and shelters were created in the 60s and 70s, reflecting the changing attitudes regarding women's autonomy over their own health. Also, birth control became more accessible to women. In 1972, the Supreme Court ruled in Massachusetts v. Baird that women, including unmarried women, had the right to privacy to use birth control if they wanted to. A year later, Roe v. Wade famously ended in the Supreme Court decision that this right to privacy also extended to abortion. Prior to Roe v. Wade, many women were having dangerous illegal abortions, with thousands hospitalized annually from abortions gone wrong, some of whom died from complications. However, abortions remained extremely controversial, and this right is still debated today. In 1975, Time magazine gave its Man of the Year award to all American women. The article accompanying the award described them as an immense variety of women altering their lives, entering new fields, functioning with a new sense of identity, integrity, and confidence.
The women's movement is far from over today. Some call this current movement third wave feminism, but some argue that the second wave is not yet over, since the original goals of second wave feminism, equal pay and equal representation in the workforce, have yet to be achieved. Opponents to the feminist movement include Phyllis Schlafly's niece, Suzanne Venker. These opponents continue to argue that gender equality leads to devalued marriages, neglect of children, and even bullying of children who lack stay-at-home mothers. The fight for equal pay continues. Women currently earn around 79% of what men do for the same job, and there are still significant efforts to increase the number of women in higher-paying fields, particularly science, technology, engineering, and math. Currently, 58% of women work, compared to the 38% that worked in 1960. Although the decision of Roe v. Wade still stands, many states have laws inhibiting women's access to abortions through institutions such as mandatory counseling and waiting periods. Some of the health clinics founded by the 60s and 70s women's movement are being forced to close or significantly losing funding.